this is the most optimistic I have been in living memory that we've agreed enough on the I'm not even remotely kidding that we agree enough on the foundation surrounding epistemology that if in fact you have a good reason for God, I think you're the one that's most likely to convince me. So the floor is yours.
Hey there, Jack. You are live on the Sunday show with Promise and Matt. Thanks so much for calling us back.
Absolutely. Thank you all for inviting me back and having me on to share my views.
Yeah, I don't know how you want to start this. Do you feel comfortable kind of bringing us back like as quickly as you can to where we were at in the conversation and giving us a starting point from there?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the best way to perhaps regain ground from where we were last time is for me to state some sort of informal claim, and then we can go from there and see where we may agree and disagree. So my claim is that God would give people just enough evidence to believe in him if they are already so inclined, but not so much that it will overwhelm somebody who is not willing or ready to believe. And I think that this is, just so we clarify before we begin the conversation, I am not making a case for God's existence from the ground up. I am simply trying to address what seems like an internal inconsistency.
Sure. So this is kind of, if I'm understanding correctly, you're trying to explain the apparent hiddenness by saying, in your view, God would give people who are inclined to believe just enough, or would provide enough evidence so that people who are already inclined to believe would accept it, but people who weren't inclined to believe would not be overwhelmed and compelled.
Yes, that seems to be the case.
Okay. Then I guess the first question is, why is that what you would expect?
Fair enough. So I think that I was actually put onto this view when I was reading author Dale Allison up in Princeton Theological Seminary. He wrote a book on the resurrection of Jesus, and he concluded it by saying, knowledge is a function of being, and religious knowledge must be a function of religious being. And then he ties it to the beatitude, the pure in heart shall see God. And so he gave some examples from the New Testament, from people such as the disciples, from Mary and Mary Magdalene, and from most importantly, Paul, who were people who knew the Christian beliefs and even arguments, but especially in the case of Paul, did not convert until something experiential happened to them. It was not the arguments or even the claims of the Christians that convinced Paul, who is one of the foremost writers of the Bible, but it was his own personal experience.
Wouldn't you consider the Damascus Road experience the exact thing you're saying we shouldn't expect? Wouldn't that be overwhelming evidence for someone who was unwilling to believe?
Yes, I see what you're saying. Let me clarify further that when I'm talking about overwhelming evidence, I mean arguments from philosophy and some of the scientific arguments that you'll hear apologists propose. I'm saying that those arguments alone for Christianity don't seem to be enough to convince somebody, but it's only hand in hand with experience that somebody converts to believe in God.
No. So what my question here is that the evidence that Paul was presented with seems to be in direct conflict with what you're saying you would expect, that God would provide people just enough evidence if they were inclined, but not enough to overwhelm them if they weren't inclined. But Paul, by his own admission in the story, was not inclined and was presented with overwhelming evidence. So that's inconsistent with what you would expect from God, right?
Yes. So let me clarify further because I perhaps may have misspoken. When I say evidence, I'm speaking of non-experiential evidence. So the kind of evidence that you would find perhaps in a laboratory when you're conducting biological experiments, or if you're a philosopher trying to argue for the existence or non-existence of a creator. So in Paul's case, he knew the claims that the Christians were making, and he was probably familiar with many of their apologetical arguments, but that alone was not enough for him because he wasn't experientially prepared to believe in God. But it was when you have the reason coupled with the experience that he was able to believe. That seems to be the pattern throughout both the Old and the New Testament.
Can I get a little clarification real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely.
So you're saying like just enough evidence, but not
Mm-hmm.
overwhelming. But do you believe that this God knows ahead of time if that evidence will be convincing to that specific person or not?
Yes, my view of God is that he is all-knowing,
So
including
then
past,
it
present, and
doesn't
future.
matter if it's just enough or quote overwhelming because no matter what, that God knows if it's convincing or not. So it's either convincing evidence or not, whether you want to rank it on a scale of what you subjectively might call overwhelming versus what you were saying would be just enough. Because no matter what, like that God knows, either this God is giving convincing evidence or is not giving convincing evidence.
Right. So I think that the way I view evidence and the way I view what is a convincing or compelling argument is more in a subjective sense. So there's a reason why you can present two people with the exact same data and they will come to wildly different conclusions because the data might
Yeah,
not
but
be convincing on its own. But it, go
sorry,
ahead. I'm sorry.
Promise's point was that whether or not it's subjective, like I might expect a different or become convinced by different evidence than you would, and Promise might have a different standard than this. But if God knows all of our standards, God automatically knows from the get-go whether or not the evidence he's presenting is compelling for that individual, and what evidence might be compelling for one individual may not be compelling for some other. And so God needs to decide, do I care to convince this person, and then provide that person with whatever is convincing, not what's over. By definition, whatever convinces you is necessarily overwhelming. It overcomes whatever resistance to being compelled you have.
That's a fair point to make. And I think that perhaps just for clarification, are you getting into the idea that, or the question, why does God, because he knows exactly what will convince everybody to believe in him, why does he not give each person that amount of evidence or experiential reason to believe in him? Is that what you're getting at?
I don't know that I'm
is certainly
getting.
part of it.
Yeah, for me right now, I'm still just stumped at the part is like why do we even need to define it as quote overwhelming evidence or just enough evidence if no matter it's either convincing evidence or it's not, and this God knows. So to me, the God is either intentionally convincing or intentionally not convincing the person based on that.
But and I'm sorry
Okay,
for
I
second
get-
guess. I'd anticipate that you're getting ready to respond to that. But that was my well, I still have another objection, which is why isn't a Damascus Road experience good enough for all of us? But let's say I have a standard of evidence and somebody else has a standard of evidence. Would you agree that it's possible that their standard of evidence is so weak that they would become convinced of other things that weren't true using that aren't true using that standard of evidence?
Yes, it happens all the time. Yeah.
Cool. I agree. So if God's fairly consistently providing in your model evidence to that lower standard that lets in other untrue things, but not enough to overcome the bar of, let's say, sound skeptical epistemology, then it would seem I have no way to tell the difference between that God existing and only providing sufficient justification for the gullible, or that God not existing and only the gullible are convinced for bad reason. How do I tell the difference?
I'm going to address your point in a slightly roundabout way. So if I fail to, please just interrupt me and correct me. But the way my claim is actually dealing with the kind of evidence that is external to experience versus experiential evidence. And we can even debate whether or not experiential evidence is evidence. But when I'm talking about evidence, generally, I'm talking about the philosophical arguments, historical arguments, etc., like we've already discussed. And so that is just plain across the board. Everyone, given the right education and opportunities to learn, has access to the same data. Now, what is different from person to person is the experience. And so it seems that the way that God has structured the universe, in my point of view, is that he is not so overwhelmingly present in any kind of empirical sense that even the strongest hard A atheist is unable to deny him. That doesn't seem to be the case. It seems that God gives us enough to believe in him if we're already so inclined, but not so much that we're going to believe in him if we're not inclined, because what matters most to God is loyalty.
Okay.
Did I somewhat address what you're getting at, or feel free to correct me if...
Well, I mean, you were talking about it. I just don't know that. So here's the thing. I would agree that with loose exceptions, we'll get rid of, people with particular deficiencies or, who haven't heard. The arguments for the existence of God and the empirical evidence that one would say might support those things, or the facts that are consistent with those, whether it counts as evidence for or just facts consistent with, those are, in an idealistic sense, available to everyone. And you're drawing a distinction between those and the experiential evidence. And I guess my question is, how can we distinguish each individual's interpretation of their experience to determine whether their understanding of that experience is most likely correct? Because I think that's something that a God would be able to do. And a God would, I don't know if that's what you're calling overwhelming, that God overcomes these doubts. But when you say someone inclined to believe, isn't a gullible person inclined to believe things that aren't true, including gods that aren't real? So how do we distinguish between gullibly being inclined towards an untrue belief and non-gullibly being inclined towards a true belief?
So just for clarification, are you talking about us, say you and me, for example, and Promise? We don't want to leave Promise out. The three of us, if we were to examine someone's belief from a more external point of view, if we could conclude what they believe is correct or incorrect, is that kind of the idea you're getting at?
Kind of. I think we can stick with the three of us and say, would I be correct in saying, Jack, that in addition to the various arguments, you are convinced because of your experience?
I would softly say yes. Yes.
Okay. Do you think that your experience should be convincing to either of us?
No, I don't.
Do you think that if we had the experience you had, we would be convinced?
I have not had an experience like Paul did on the Damascus Road. So there was no point in my life where I just had this overwhelming religious experience. I think that my experience overall is a combination of the way perhaps that I just view life itself. And I mean, even you'll hear commonly people talking about they believe in God just because they can look at other people and they see life, and for them that's enough to believe. And so that kind of like long lifetime of experience is kind of what I have experienced. I hope that was somewhat clarifying. So no, when you look at my life from your perspective, I don't expect you at all to be convinced based on the arguments I give alone or any of the small e experiences that I've had.
Okay, that's not what I was getting at. It's if
Okay.
I had whatever the experience tipping point is for you that goes beyond mere argument, mere analytical things. Whether it's, you look around the world and you feel this, you experience that, whatever that is, you clearly feel that ought to compel someone, right?
I feel that ought to compel me. And I know that sounds perhaps shockingly subjective for a Christian to give on this show. I didn't hear you. Would you mind repeating yourself?
Is truth subjective?
No, I don't believe truth is subjective.
So if in fact there is, if it is true that the God that you're convinced exists, then that is a non-subjective truth. And do you have something other than subjective interpretations of experience that convinces you of that truth that we have access to?
So I can I mean, I could sit on this show and talk with y'all all day long, and we can throw around ideas about the historicity of the resurrection or the arguments from contingency or teleology. But I don't believe that that is enough to convince you, nor do I necessarily think that it should. So I think that what convinces people, and this is where I get back to the idea of it being an internal problem. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, the pure in heart shall see God. And so that idea, not pure in terms of without sin, because none of us are without sin, and so none of us are inclined to see God fully, I believe. But I think that those who are open to him, once they interpret the different arguments for and against God, will be more inclined and should be more inclined to believe in him.
Can I ask? Sorry, I'm kind of going back just one step, but
Absolutely.
so the subjective evidence, I don't know if that's an okay term for it, that you have, part of your reason for being convinced. If somebody from another religion presented that same experience or subjective reasoning for why they believe, would you take that as sufficient reason for their belief?
Just for clarification, are you asking if I would be convinced by their experience, or if they ought to be convinced by their experience?
If you would be thinking that that was a valid reason for them to believe, would you think that's a good reason for them to believe?
I will say generally yes, but of course it entirely depends on what it is they're believing. I think that a lot has to go and has to be said about the object of their faith.
Okay. I guess I'm just trying to understand how much of your belief is made up based off of, things like basic apologetics, and then how much is just like this personal thing to you that maybe some people would call faith, the thing that fills in the gap, basically. But we don't even have to get into that if you don't want to. Sorry, I keep going back, but there's little things I'm taking notes on. At one point earlier, you said something about loyalty, when you were talking about how like God doesn't want to overwhelm somebody with evidence because he cares about loyalty above all else. Am I appropriately remembering that?
Yes, that seems to be the case. But just if I can clarify it a little bit further, loyalty in God entails loyalty to goodness as well. So it's not just blind obedience to some kind of divine ruler, but it's also obedience to what is good and true and beneficial to all people.
Sure, which I'm assuming under your definition of a God, you probably think God is representative of all of that. But my thing is, I don't understand how overwhelming evidence would take away from someone's ability to be loyal, because like I have overwhelming evidence that my husband exists. I'm also extremely loyal to him. And a lot of that is because obviously I have to have evidence of him and who he is and all these things. There's trust that's built there. So I don't understand how like an experience that's overwhelming, if that's the terminology we want to use, how does that take away from this like purity test of being loyal? Am I making sense with that question?
Yeah, 100%. And I think that's probably the strongest objection I've heard made against my view of this, because and it absolutely makes sense, because like with the example of you and your husband, you would say, hey, I am fully loyal to him, I fully trust him, he trusts me, but I'm also fully aware that he exists, and that doesn't detract from my loyalty to him, and vice versa. And I think that's a valid point to make. I won't claim to have the full answers as to why I believe God does this. I'm just addressing this as kind of an internal view within Christianity, that it seems that, especially in the New Testament, when you're reading the Gospels, Jesus uses intentionally vague language so that those whom God wants to call to him, he does through the language, but those who have already hardened themselves away from God won't understand. But I just want to say in humility that I don't have a full answer to this.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, because to me, it doesn't sound like the logic is there to back, I get it, that you are looking at what Jesus's message was and how he kind of communicated and what you think he was communicating. And it does feel like trying to make logic fit that instead of the other way around, if that makes sense. And so I think that's where this argument loses me, is that I don't find it compelling because, if nothing else, that example of like the things that drive me to loyalty, to the most genuine loyalty that I have, is a lot of overwhelming evidence and a lot of mutual respect and lack of hierarchy and all of that. So I don't know. Maybe Matt has some questions now, but I think that's kind of where I land on this conversation.
Can I throw out a quick hypothesis as well? And I appreciate you, by the way, for bringing this up, because I think it's definitely something that Christians and theists in general need to be considering more than we do. So I think that one hypothesis that someone could posit for why God does not overwhelm people and why loyalty seems to be somewhat inharmonious with overwhelming empirical evidence. One hypothesis could be that the kind of loyalty that you seemingly extract from experiential turning points, like Paul's Damascus Road experience, that kind of loyalty might just be that much stronger than the kind of loyalty that you might get from an understanding that's solely based on empiricism and arguments from philosophy, etc. But I also want to, we don't know this for sure. That's just one hypothesis that could be made. Definitely something worth exploring. So thank you for bringing it up.
Yeah, I think I might get back into there. I'm struggling with several things. You described, and I think correctly, what often convinces people, but I think what convinces people is almost certainly distinct from what ought to convince people. And so on a number of occasions, you've gone back to the Bible to talk about expectations. You talked about loyalty to goodness and truth. I don't necessarily know that, I care for that, description, but I certainly appreciate and would strive to be loyal to goodness and truth. But if truth is an objective fact, I don't see how a subjective justification is deserving of respect or loyalty, or how that subjective demonstration confirms the truth. And if goodness is the goal, I guess part of the question is, why would it be good to provide some people with the experience to compel belief and not provide that to others? And when you appeal to the Bible, sorry to pile on, I just took notes, but I definitely don't see that book or the character of the God in that book to be either true or good. So I don't know how you get to loyalty to good when the character in that book is advocating original sin, inherited sin, regulating and sanctioning slavery and inequality between the sexes and substitutionary atonement and then selectively providing a Damascus Road experience to one, the sort of experience for some, and not to others, and then making claims about, if you ask whatever you ask for, God will provide it and reveal himself and all that stuff. And then Promise and I sit here with what we thought were experiences when we were believers. And then when we learned about sound epistemology, all of a sudden those experiences go away and God doesn't seem to show up to offer them again. So it's like the book advocates for God playing favorites. I mean, the Jews were his chosen people. And then later on, he's going to decide who, by his grace, he is going to extend faith and salvation to. So I don't see any of this as true or good. And I don't know how you can get there from a subjective experience. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah, I want to respond briefly to at least all those points briefly if I can. So if I miss one, would you please jump in and just kind of set me back on track?
I'll probably just wait. There's a lot there, and I want to give you some space, and I'll mute, but I'm taking notes.
Well, I appreciate that, and I should be taking notes as well. I failed to do that. That would have been a very good idea. But I think I'll start briefly with the character of God in the Bible. I have I have seen your slavery debate with Dr. Josh and the Kneckleys probably 3 times over. It was highly entertaining. And I will actually say I largely agree with your position that you take in that debate. And I don't believe that God sanctioned or desired the ownership of other people as property in the Old Testament. I am not fully on board with divine dictation theory when it comes to inerrancy in the Bible. So there are some things that are in the Bible that I think are incorrect. I think they're few and far between, and they mostly revolve around historical topics. But I'm not sure what to make of slavery yet, but I don't think it's consistent with my view of God. There's some views about the suzerain vassal treaty, which the Old Testament, the Levitical law was based off the ancient Near East suzerain vassal treaties. And in the Mosaic law, God is the suzerain, Israel's the vassal. And there are some historians who have proposed that the way that it's written is a kind of wartime propaganda, where when it says God is legislating slavery to the Israelites, it's actually a way of writing that the Israelites are pleading with God for slavery. Now, I'm not a historian, nor do I speak Hebrew, so I cannot say for sure or even anything close, but there are a number of ways around that. As far as why he would give some people these subjective experiences that they require to believe in him, but perhaps God doesn't give other people these subjective experiences that he knows would tip them to loyalty in him. Again, that's a great question, but I think that God will give people experiences when they are open to it. And you've probably heard something along those lines before, and in many ways it can be a tired argument. Usually it's phrased in the way of, you have to stop sinning in order to see God, or if your heart is too sinful, God won't reveal himself to you. I don't think that's quite right. I think it's a little more psychological than that. I think that God reveals himself experientially to those who are already open to him. And so ultimately he allows it to be a matter of free will, which again, we can go down that topic if you want to. I love talking about free will and the debates, the arguments for and against it. But from my view, God gives people the free will to position their hearts towards or away from him. And when they're positioned towards him, he is inclined to give them subjective experiences that can overwhelm them and bring them to loyalty. Is there anything I quite missed in what you said that I have yet to address?
Well, I'll say no, because I think what you did just there is, it's kind of a vague waving away. So you're like, you don't think the Bible is correct in all things. Cool. I don't know how we tell which things it's correct about and which ones we don't. That seems to be sort of like a cherry picking of convenience. But it also doesn't, you say there's a number of ways around the problem. I don't know that any of those ways get around the problem of why would a God allow a book to repeatedly misrepresent him, resulting in immorality and death without a clear correction, death and slavery without a clear correction. When you say that, why is God selective about who he's going to allow to have the experiences? And it's based on this notion of free will. And it's about who is already inclined or leaning that direction. That's an exhausting hand waving that doesn't remotely explain how, when I was already a sincere believer who thought that God wanted me to be in ministry, and I'm on my knees crying and begging for God to help me to do what I'm convinced at the time he wants me to do. I don't know how anybody, I can't say, okay, there might have been something wrong, something that I wasn't open to, but if I'm begging God to address that and I get nothing back, and all the people who are telling me, oh, there must have been some secret sin or some secret blockage or God gave me whatever, those are all excuses that they have no evidence for at all. And it seems like just a post hoc rationalization for why they can be convinced, but they need a way to explain why I wasn't convinced. Why didn't God reveal himself to me? And it's not just me, though. It's all the people who are in the clergy project, and it's countless non-believers out there. And I guess the thing is, do you think there is such a thing as non-resistant non-belief? Because if so, that seems to contradict your view that, or maybe your view is it's not just being non-resistant, you have to be eagerly looking for it. But now we're back to people who are eagerly looking for a God are going to find one and convince themselves, including of all the other gods that don't exist if one does.
Okay, so I largely agree with a lot of what you said, and I want to be very careful because I don't want to ever speak to your personal experience or anyone else's specifically. I know I've been here speaking generally about subjective experiences, but when it comes to your own, either in the past or now, or promises or anyone else's, I don't want to ever say it was because of X, Y, Z that God didn't reveal himself to you. I think that can lead to a lot of potential blaming on somebody, either in their individual doctrine or...
Jack.
Sorry? Yes.
Please, at least with us, do me a favor and skip the I don't want to be offensive disclaimer thing. What I'm looking for is, how can you or me or anyone else tell the difference between what seems to be your post hoc justification for how God works from I'm just making stuff up about how God works? Is there some way that we can use to tell the difference between whether or not your suppositions about God are real or rationalizations?
I don't think we can test it empirically. And I don't know if that's perhaps exactly what you're asking, but I think it becomes difficult to test how hypothetically God would work when we're sitting from our perspective. I don't think we're even able to do that. When it comes to cherry picking the Bible, I think when I was saying there are ways around problems like potential condoning of slavery in the Old Testament, I just mean that there are reasons that we might possibly be misunderstanding it when we read it now. That God didn't, when he was, perhaps overseeing the creation of the Bible, when he was doing that, he wasn't mistaken, but that perhaps we're mistaken in our way of reading it. Now, when it comes to differentiating, yes?
Oh, I was just going to say, if what you're saying is there's no way to tell, if this is an untestable claim, as far as I can tell, untestable claims are useless.
It's an untestable external claim. The problem of divine hiddenness is one of internal consistency or inconsistency. So I'm not trying to build a case from the ground up that God is like this or God does X, Y, Z.
No. The divine hiddenness is about, if you want to, in a nutshell, it's, hey, we would expect this if this particular God existed. And if you want to say, your expectations are flawed, that's fine, but you'd have to show what the justification is for why some other set of expectations are correct. And if you have no testable way to demonstrate what the expectations should be, then you can make any claim you want, and they're all on equal footing. They're all on similar sand being washed away. I need a way to say, given the God that I believe in, here's the testable way to reach expectations. Because until you do that, you don't have a claim that we can even evaluate.
So my view of Christianity and God is one that consists of God compelling people to believe in him, sometimes through a combination of experience and empirical evidence, but oftentimes just pushing them by experience. And so taking a step back from Christianity or even from theism, when I look at the world, that is how I see that people turn to turn to God and turn to belief in a higher power. Are you asking again why this kind of experiential evidence should convince somebody, and how we can know that it should convince somebody?
In part, but you're describing how you view the world. You're not doing anything to tell us why that should be the correct way to view the world. And that's the only thing I care about. Like, if not, and this is, not to slag you off or anything, but every Yahoo that calls in with any belief that is ultimately untestable, that does not have a framework that we can evaluate. I mean, I don't put you in the same category necessarily as the loon who feels that there are pixies in the garden that are doing rain chants and causing it to rain in Mongolia when they live in Philadelphia. But that claim is similarly untestable to yours. And so if I'm going to, if the whole point here is to say, we have good reason to think there is a God and that we can understand how that God works, and then we can demonstrate that we're seeing things that are consistent with that. I don't know how you do that how do I tell the difference between your claims about God and anybody else's claims about anything if they're all untestable?
So I am making untestable claims. I agree with you on that. However, I want to reiterate that I'm not building a case for my worldview from the ground up. This is not an attempt to try and persuade you or Promise or anyone listening now that they should believe in God, or that they should even believe that God acts this way. What I'm doing is I'm offering a reasonable justification from my point of view that this is how God works. And okay.
You're not. You don't get, I'm not going to, there's no offense to you, Jack. You're my favorite caller of the year, and I'm enjoying the conversation. But if you're going to be, I'm not trying to convince you, then you've called the wrong show. Mm-hmm. And if you think that you're making a reasonable case when you're presenting something that is untestable, then you don't know what reasonable means. It's not reasonable for you to believe and to advocate for an untestable position. I can come up with any number of untestable positions and say they're reasonable, but that's not how reason works.
So again, I want to be very clear. I didn't say I'm not trying to convince you or Promise. I said I'm not trying to convince you or Promise that God exists or that God works in this way. I'm trying to make the case for an internal consistency within my Christian view.
I don't give a shit about internal consistency.
If you want...
Any piece of science fiction, the best pieces of science fiction are internally consistent. It's when the science fiction breaks that internal consistency that we are no longer able to suspend our disbelief, and we're like, that's bullshit. They completely changed the rules for how magic works in this. But as long as you have a fairly simple system, internal consistency is irrelevant to whether or not it's true in the reality we experience. And all I don't care about fictions that are internally consistent. I care about claims and whether or not they're true in reality.
Yeah, and I think I get it. I get I remember from the other call, like what your goal is in this conversation, and, attempting to kind of explain this thing. But like Matt said, it sounds like saying like, yeah, but this thing in this book makes sense because of this, it's a justification for something that we're not even interested in if the character itself that you're trying to, make seem reasonable, if we don't even have reason to think they exist, And so, but here's my problem. I don't think you've even made it like my issue with the whole loyalty thing, and why wouldn't if a God knows if somebody's going to be convinced or not, why wouldn't a God just let everybody be convinced? Or why is he creating people that can't be convinced? There's a lot that we didn't even get into on that. So for me, I don't feel that it was a reasonable explanation for the internal discrepancy, nor was there, which you said that wasn't your goal. There also wasn't a case for any of it being true, much less making sense, even just as a false story. But I am, oh, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, I'm sorry. You finish. I've talked a lot.
I was just going to say, Jack, again, you're a great caller. I I would really love to have an entire conversation just about free will. And you said that you liked that. So again, sorry to tell you to call back another time, but, and because Matt might have more to say on this call, but just in general, if you'd ever like to call back when I'm hosting and talk about free will specifically, I think we could have a really cool conversation about that would go into a different direction than where this one went. But I would love to have that.
That's pretty much what I was going to say, because we have like 4 other callers that are theists who are on hold who may have a different view than you. So let's just plan to have a discussion another time about free will or something else, or, something along those lines. But let's stick a fork in it for today. We'll all think about it some more, and we'll get some other callers in.
Does that sound all right with you,
All right,
Jeff?
I appreciate your time. Is there an email that I can reach out to either of you by to perhaps get more information?
I can give you my email address. It's public. I can't promise to ever reply to it. I have tens of thousands of emails that never get replied, but mine is sans.deity, sans.deity @gmail.com.
And mine is Eve was framed. Mine is Eve was framed.contact @gmail.com.
All right. Thank you both. I appreciate that. And thank you again for letting me take up so much of your time.